In the summer of 1832, deep in the cottonlands of Mississippi, a birth took place that no one dared record. Beneath the flicker of a single candle, an enslaved woman named Eliza brought a child into the world whose very skin defied belief. He was pale as milk, his hair nearly colorless, his eyes like gray glass. The women who helped deliver him crossed themselves and whispered that God had made a mistake. By sunrise, word spread that a ghost had been born at Cedar Hill. The mistress fainted, and the master, Horace Vane, studied the child with cold fascination before declaring, "A curiosity worth keeping." From that moment, the boy's life was not his own. His name was Marco, though many would call him other things: omen, curse, angel, abomination. Before we begin, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because stories like this, stories buried beneath history's silence, need to be told. Now let us return to that sweltering Mississippi morning when the ghost of Cedar Hill first drew breath. In the summer of 1832, deep in the river country of Mississippi, the cries of a newborn echoed through the slave quarters of Cedar Hill Plantation. The women gathered around the mother, their hands trembling as they wiped the sweat from her brow, expecting to welcome another brown-skinned child into a world that had no mercy for any of them. But when the baby emerged, the room fell silent. His skin was the color of milk, his lashes, his brows, his hair nearly invisible. When he opened his eyes, they were a pale gray blue, clouded and strange, like storm water. Someone whispered the word curse. Another crossed herself. The midwife hesitated before cutting the cord, muttering that the child had been washed too long in the other world. By the time word reached the main house, panic had already begun to ripple through the quarters. The mistress, Margaret Vane, insisted on seeing the child herself. When the midwife carried him in, wrapped in a torn piece of linen, the lady of the house took one look and screamed. The baby's ghost-like face reflected in her silver mirror, and she fainted dead away. Horace Vane, the master of Cedar Hill, did not scream. He stared. The candlelight glinted off the baby's pale skin, and his expression turned from disgust to curiosity. "A curiosity worth keeping," he said finally. "God makes strange things for his reasons. This one will stay." The mother, a woman named Eliza, begged to keep her son close, to nurse him herself, but Horace forbade it. He feared the boy's color would frighten the others. The child was placed in a small room behind the kitchen, halfway between the house and the quarters, too white to belong below, too black to belong above. The weeks passed, and whispers grew. Field hands said the baby did not cry at night, only stared at the ceiling as if listening for something they couldn't hear. The cook swore she saw his reflection move in the copper pans, even when he lay still. The overseer spat and said he'd seen enough of the devil in this world without a ghost child living among them. By autumn, the boy was named Marco. No one could remember who chose it. His mother said it meant a mark. And maybe that was all he would ever be, a sign of something no one wanted to understand. At night, she would slip from her cabin to watch him through the kitchen window, the faint glow of the hearth lighting his pale face. He didn't look cursed to her. He looked lost, like something heaven had dropped by mistake. By the time Marco turned 7, the world had already decided what he was not. He was not fit for the fields, where the sun blistered his fragile skin until it peeled like paper. He was not welcome in the quarters, where children laughed and pointed, calling him Ghost Boy. So Horace Vane, the master of Cedar Hill, found another purpose for him. He kept Marco close, inside the grand house of white columns and blood money, where curiosity could be turned into spectacle. To the guests who arrived in wagons and carriages, Horace would gesture toward the pale child standing silently in the corner. "Ever seen one like him?" he'd boast, sipping brandy. "Born from a black woman, yet looks like something heaven forgot to finish." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, and Marco learned quickly that silence was safer than sound. When he spoke, it made people uncomfortable. When he didn't, it made them forget he was human. He fetched letters, polished boots, carried trays too heavy for his small hands. The mistress, still uneasy around him, refused to let him enter her parlor. "He unsettles me," she said once. "He looks like a sickness that learned to walk." Yet she allowed him to stand behind her chair during dinner, unseen but always present, because her husband demanded it. Horace liked to see him there, pale as bone, the living reminder that he owned even the strangest things God could make. At night, when the house grew still and the lamps burned low, Marco would wander the halls, memorizing every creak in the floorboards. He studied the portraits of the vain ancestors that lined the walls, men in military coats, women draped in pearls, and wondered if they had ever looked at him from their painted eyes. He would whisper the names written beneath each frame, trying to form words no one had taught him to say aloud. Sometimes, when Horace's guests had drunk too much, they called Marco into the room. They'd make him stand by the firelight, turn his head from side to side, and bet on what he was. "Part angel, part sin," one said. "A warning," said another. Marco stood perfectly still, his gray eyes calm and distant, because stillness was the only weapon he had. In that house of gold chandeliers and cold hearts, Marco became both decoration and secret. He learned to move without sound, to listen without reacting. He learned that belonging meant nothing, because even when he was closest to the master, he was still just property, something to be shown, not someone to be known. It happened in the summer of Marco's 9th year, on a day so hot the air itself seemed to tremble. The house was alive with noise, servants rushing to prepare for visitors from Natchez. Horace Vane had invited them to Cedar Hill to discuss cotton, politics, and power, though everyone knew those three things were one and the same. Marco had been ordered to carry a silver tray of sweet tea through the kitchen and out to the veranda, his movements precise, his silence expected. The guest never saw him coming. A senator's wife, pale and perfumed, swept through the doorway in search of cool air and nearly collided with the boy. Her eyes widened at the sight of him, skin as white as her own, eyes pale and unblinking. She gasped, recoiling. "What is a white child doing in the kitchen?" she cried. "Who let this intruder in?" The room froze. The other servants stared at the floor, afraid to breathe. Within moments, Horace Vane himself appeared, summoned by the sound of her voice. His expression hardened as he looked at Marco. The misunderstanding was dangerous. It could invite questions no man in his position could afford. So he smiled at the senator's wife, the kind of smile that hid cruelty behind charm. "Not a child, ma'am," he said. "Property." The word silenced her shock, but it did not soothe his pride. That night, Horace called for Marco to be brought to the barn. The smell of hay and iron filled the air. On a wooden table lay a small branding iron, its tip glowing orange in the firelight. "There can be no confusion," Horace said softly. "A man's possessions should bear his mark." Marco didn't cry when the iron touched his skin. The sound it made a hiss, like meat on a skillet, burned itself into the minds of those who watched. The overseer turned away. The other slaves did not move. Horace pressed the iron just long enough to ensure the scar would never fade. The boy's skin blistered, the smell of scorched flesh rising into the humid air. When it was done, Horace stepped back, admiring his work. The mark was small but clear, a letter V carved in fire above Marco's shoulder blade. "Now," he said, "there will be no mistaking what you are." For days, Marco lay awake, feverish, the wound throbbing against his heartbeat. When he touched it, he could still feel the iron, still hear Horace's voice. In the years to come, the scar would heal, but the lesson would not. Purity of skin meant nothing. Whiteness did not save him. In the world of Cedar Hill, even angels could be branded. Across the slow brown waters of the Yazoo River stood Magnolia Vale, a plantation as grand as it was decayed, owned by the widow Constance Bellamy. Locals called her the Duchess of the Delta, though never within earshot. She was a woman of impossible wealth, rumored cruelty, and a body that filled every room she entered. At 50, she ruled her land from a velvet chair like a monarch whose crown had been purchased with sorrow instead of gold. The house itself reflected its mistress. It was beautiful once, but years of indulgence had left it bloated and tired. Curtains of imported lace hung heavy with dust. The walls were lined with portraits of men who had loved her fortune more than her face, all of them long dead and none missed. Outside, magnolias bloomed thick and white against the dark soil, their sweetness almost choking in the summer air. Constance had inherited Magnolia Vale from her late husband, a man who drank himself to death before the ink on their marriage certificate had dried. Since his passing, she had lived surrounded by luxuries and silence. She dined alone at long tables filled with enough food to feed 10 people, servants rushing in and out like ghosts afraid to linger. Silver platters groaned under roasted duck, candied peaches, and sweet cakes soaked in bourbon. Yet for all her indulgence, she could never fill the hollow inside her. Her days followed a ritual of vanity and command. Mornings began with lavender baths and powders that could not mask the redness of her skin. Afternoons were spent dictating orders to the overseer, her voice carrying through the house like a hymn turned cruel. By evening, she perfumed herself in rosewater and sat at her window, watching the river shimmer in the fading light. Some said she waited for a visitor who would never come. Others whispered she waited for death. But beneath her grandeur, there lived a bitterness no servant dared name. Constance knew the women of the county mocked her size, her loneliness, her insatiable hunger for control. She heard their laughter echoing through the gossip of their husbands, so she made fear her armor. Her servants obeyed her without question, and when they failed, they were sold. Magnolia Vale became her fortress, built on obedience and silence. One evening, as the cicadas droned and the river caught the last blush of sunset, Constance sat alone at her supper table, staring into her glass of wine. The reflection that looked back at her was not the woman she remembered. The beauty was gone, the softness hardened by years of power and isolation. She raised the glass in a silent toast to her own company and murmured, "If God made me in His image, He must be very lonely." Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon. Inside, the mistress of Magnolia Vale smiled a smile sharp enough to cut through the quiet and reached for another drink. By the spring of 1841, Cedar Hill had begun to rot from the inside. The cotton yields had fallen, the debts had risen, and Horace Vane's name, once spoken with respect in Natchez, now carried the faint odor of desperation. The creditors came first, men in pressed coats and wide hats who spoke in polite threats. Then came the auctioneers, with their ledgers, their scales, and their cold arithmetic that turned people into columns of ink. On the morning of the sale, the plantation yard filled with voices that hummed like flies over a carcass. Wagons rolled in from neighboring counties, carrying planters, speculators, and men who made their fortunes in flesh. Women brought parasols and lemonade, treating the spectacle like a fair. The smell of mud and sweat hung in the air. From the porch of the big house, Horace Vane stood with his pipe clenched between his teeth, his eyes hard and distant. The world he built from stolen labor was being sold piece by piece, and he was determined to pretend it didn't hurt. They started with the field hands. Strong men fetched good prices, women of childbearing age even more. The auctioneer called their names and bodies were traded like livestock, their fates decided by nods and numbers. Some cried out as their families were separated, others simply stared, already hollowed out by knowing this day would come. Marco waited behind the stables, his hands bound loosely, watching the line shorten. His name had been written at the very bottom of the list beside a single word: defective. He was smaller than most men his age, his skin too pale to work under the sun, his sight weak in the light. The overseer had told him weeks ago that no one would buy a ghost. When his turn came, the laughter started before the auctioneer even spoke. The crowd parted, curious, whispering as Marco stepped forward, his skin gleaming like bone under the sky. The auctioneer, unsure how to describe him, cleared his throat. Approximately 16 years of age. Albino. Fragile. Unfit for field labor. The laughter grew. One man joked he'd make a fine scarecrow. Another that he'd melt in the rain. No hands went up. No bids came. Horace Vane stood on the porch, expression unreadable. For him, this was humiliation. A man who prided himself on the quality of his stock could not even sell the strangest of them. $5, the auctioneer called half-heartedly. Silence. The man sighed. $1 then. Surely he's worth $1 to someone. The crowd murmured, but no one moved. In that moment, Marco felt the peculiar sting of being both seen and unseen. They laughed at him, but they would not claim him. He was too white to be pitied, too black to be spared, too different to be owned. When the auctioneer finally declared the lot unsold, the boy's eyes drifted to the horizon where the river shimmered in the heat. Somewhere beyond it, someone would one day decide his worth. But for now, in that circle of dust and laughter, he belonged to no one at all. The sun hung mercilessly over the auction yard, turning the air into a haze of dust and sweat. By afternoon, most of the day's business had been done. The strong men were gone, bought by neighboring planters. The women who could cook, sew, or breed had been taken too. Only the unwanted remained: the crippled, the sick, the old, and the strange. And standing among them, silent and pale as a washed-out moon, was Marco. The auctioneer wiped his brow, weary from shouting prices that no one cared to pay. He looked toward the road, hoping for one last bidder to appear before he called the sale to an end. That was when the crowd stirred. From beyond the gate came the slow creak of carriage wheels, the stomp of hooves, and the shimmer of sunlight on polished brass. The onlookers turned as a black carriage rolled to a stop, drawn by two glossy mares. When the door opened, the air seemed to hold its breath. A woman stepped out, heavy-set and towering, her presence commanding even before she spoke. A black veil covered her face from the Mississippi sun, but everyone knew who she was. Constance Bellamy of Magnolia Vale, widow, heiress, and legend whispered through every plantation from Vicksburg to New Orleans. She was known for her appetite, for her temper, and for the wealth that insulated her from shame. Constance moved slowly through the crowd, her cane pressing deep into the dust. Her perfume, thick and floral, mingled with the smell of sweat and soil. The auctioneer straightened his coat as she approached, stammering a greeting. She ignored him. Her eyes had already found Marco. He stood still, his wrists bound loosely in rope, the sun bleaching his pale skin until it looked translucent. The other bidders had already dismissed him, but Constance stared with unnerving fascination. "He looks like the ghost of my sins," she murmured, loud enough for those nearest to hear. A ripple of uneasy laughter followed her words. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, this one's unusual. Weak, but obedient. I'd take $1 for him if only to close the books." Constance did not hesitate. She reached into her silk purse, withdrew a single coin, and held it up between her fingers. "Then take it," she said. "I'll have the ghost." The crowd broke into laughter. Some clapped, others jeered, but no one else offered a bid. The gavel struck the block with a dull crack. "Sold," the auctioneer called, his voice echoing over the square. As the laughter faded, Constance Bellamy turned toward her carriage without another word. Her servants followed, dragging Marco behind them. He stumbled once, catching a final glimpse of Horace Vane watching from the porch, his expression neither pleased nor regretful. Within moments, the carriage door shut, sealing Marco's fate inside its velvet dark. The wheels turned, carrying him away from Cedar Hill and toward Magnolia Vale, the home of a woman who had bought him not out of need, but out of something far more dangerous: curiosity. The carriage crossed the bridge over the Yazoo River as twilight painted the water copper and gold. Marco sat quietly in the back, his wrists still bound, the steady rhythm of the wheels drowning his thoughts. He had not spoken since the auction. The driver, a broad man in a black coat, never turned his head. The only sound inside was the faint rattle of glass perfume bottles rolling with each turn of the road. Across from him sat Constance Bellamy, the woman who had bought him with a single coin. Her veil was lifted now, revealing a face both regal and ruined. Flesh heavy around her jaw, eyes dark and sharp beneath painted brows. She studied him the way a collector studies a rare specimen, curious, appraising, detached. "Do you know where we're going?" she asked finally. Marco shook his head. "Magnolia Vale," she said, almost to herself. "My home, and now yours." They arrived at nightfall. The plantation rose out of the dark like a ghostly cathedral. Massive white columns guarded the front steps, streaked with mildew and moonlight. The air smelled thick of magnolia blossoms, sweet to the point of sickness, layered over the faint stench of something dying. Fireflies drifted through the humid air, blinking like tired souls. Inside, the house was grand and exhausted. Velvet curtains drooped, heavy with dust. Chandeliers sparkled weakly under candlelight, their crystals trembling in the heat. Portraits of the Bellamy ancestors stared down from the walls, faces proud and watchful, as if judging what their descendant had brought home. Marco felt their painted eyes follow him as he crossed the threshold. The servants greeted their mistress with quiet fear. They bowed, murmured, "Welcome home, ma'am," and disappeared quickly down the halls. No one met Marco's gaze. They looked through him, as though he were a shadow or a bad omen. Constance noticed. "Do not mind them," she said softly. "They are simple people. You will serve me alone." That night, she led him to a small room adjoining her chambers. The space was dim and spare, with a narrow bed and a single candle that melted faster than it burned. "You will sleep here," she said. "When I call, you come. When I rest, you wait. Do you understand?" Marco nodded, his throat tight. When she left, closing the door behind her, he sat on the edge of the bed listening to the house breathe. The walls creaked like old bones. The air tasted of sugar and rot. Somewhere outside, cicadas sang until the sound became a hum, steady and endless. He realized then that Magnolia Vale was not just a home, it was a living thing, pulsing with secrets, feeding on silence. In that silence, Marco understood what the mistress meant when she said he would serve her alone. It was not a command, it was a sentence. Mornings at Magnolia Vale began with the rustle of silk and the smell of perfume. The house seemed to wake only when Constance Bellamy did, and when she did, every servant moved like wind around her, silent, unseen, terrified. All except one. Marco's place was no longer among the house staff. He was summoned to her side before breakfast, standing near her mirror as she dressed, his pale reflection hovering beside hers like some fragile ghost caught in the glass. Constance had grown fascinated by him. She said it began with pity, but everyone in the house knew better. She would run her fingers across his arm, studying the strange softness of his skin, and smile as though she had discovered something sacred. "My porcelain boy," she would murmur, the words slow and heavy with satisfaction. "God made you too delicate for the world. Perhaps that is why he sent you to me." She dressed him in linen shirts finer than any servant should wear, and fed him food meant for her table, sweet fruits, soft cakes, roasted meat, dripping with glaze. When he tried to refuse, she laughed. "Do you think I feed you out of kindness? You please my eye, Marco. You should look the part." He did not answer. He had learned that silence pleased her most. The other servants avoided him completely now. To them, he was an omen wrapped in human skin. The mistress's pet, a dangerous thing to acknowledge. When they crossed paths in the corridor, they lowered their eyes and whispered prayers. In the evenings, Constance would call for him to read aloud in her parlor. The words trembled from his mouth while she sat surrounded by candlelight, her face glowing, her breath shallow with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Sometimes, as he read, she would close her eyes and reach for him, her fingers grazing the air until they found his cheek. The touch was both tender and possessive. "You calm me," she whispered one night, her voice breaking. "Everyone else fears me, but you don't." Marco wanted to tell her that fear had no use here, that he had learned long ago it could not save him. The house grew quieter in those days, as if holding its breath. Constance spent less time with her servants, more with her porcelain boy. She began to speak to him not as a slave, but as something in between, a mirror for her loneliness, a vessel for her need. Yet, when she smiled at him across her gilded table, Marco felt only the chill of understanding. He was not her companion, nor her comfort. He was her reflection, something beautiful, fragile, and entirely owned. By the time autumn settled over Magnolia Vale, the rhythm of the house had changed completely. The servants no longer lit the mistress's lamps or poured her wine. Those tasks belonged to Marco now. Each evening, after supper, Constance Bellamy would retreat to her drawing room, where the curtains stayed drawn tight, and the scent of candle wax mixed with perfume. There she would wait for him, her great body sinking into a velvet chair, her eyes glimmering with something between hunger and sorrow. On a small table beside her sat a Bible, its pages worn soft from years of being opened and ignored, and a thin book of poetry bound in green leather. These were Marco's lessons. She would hand him one or the other and motion for him to begin reading. His voice, quiet and uncertain, filled the room like a fragile melody. The firelight painted his skin gold, and Constance would watch him as if his very breath were art. He often stumbled on words, not from ignorance but from fear of his own sound. Every mistake made him flinch, every pause stretched like eternity. When that happened, she would rise slowly from her chair and cross the room. Her silks whispered as she moved. She would place her hand against his cheek, her touch cold and deliberate, and whisper, "Speak softer. You're too beautiful to sound so frightened." The words lingered, sinking beneath his skin. At first, the touch made him tremble. Later, he simply endured it, learning the exact tone that pleased her, the careful balance between obedience and breath. She called it refinement. He called it survival. The lessons went on for hours. She made him read psalms about mercy, then poems about love, her expression unreadable as the meanings blurred together. Sometimes, she made him stand close enough that her perfume wrapped around him like smoke. When she closed her eyes, he could feel her breath against his neck, slow and possessive. Outside, the cicadas sang their endless hymn, and inside, the mistress and her ghost recited verses that no longer belonged to God. Words once meant for devotion became instruments of control. The more he read, the more she needed to hear him. She said his voice calmed her, that it made her forget the cruelties whispered about her by other planters' wives. But Marco began to realize the truth. It was not peace she sought, it was power. Each verse he spoke reminded her that even her loneliness could be ruled. When the candles finally guttered out, she would dismiss him with a soft smile. "Good night, my porcelain boy," she would say, her tone both tender and cruel. He would bow his head, his eyes lowered, and retreat into the dark hall, his voice still trembling in the air behind him, like the echo of a prayer never meant to be answered. The evening of the feast arrived, wrapped in the heavy sweetness of magnolia and roasted meat. Magnolia Vale had not seen such a gathering in years. Carriages lined the long dirt drive, their wheels cracking the silence of the countryside. Inside, the house glowed with candlelight, its faded grandeur polished for display. Constance Bellamy had decided to remind Mississippi society that she was still its queen, and this night would be her coronation. The dining hall shimmered with excess. Silver plates gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, and the table stretched so long it seemed to vanish into shadow. Servants moved like ghosts between the guests, pouring wine and arranging platters piled high with food. Ducks glazed in honey, oysters floating in cream, peaches baked in brandy. The guests murmured their admiration while exchanging careful glances. No one came to Magnolia Vale without a measure of fear. When Constance entered, every conversation stopped. She was draped in crimson silk, her figure commanding the entire room. On her arm, to the astonishment of all, walked Marco. The guests froze. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a single gasp breaking the silence. No one could quite believe what they were seeing. The mistress of Magnolia Vale had brought her pale servant to dine among them. "Please, sit," she said sweetly. motioning for Marco to take the chair beside hers at the head of the table. The words carried no room for refusal. The others obeyed, though the men exchanged uneasy smirks and the women lifted lace fans to hide their whispers. Dinner began. Constance spoke with theatrical warmth, filling the silence with stories of her late husband, of trade and crops, of the hardships of widowhood. Yet her attention never strayed far from Marco. She corrected his posture, smoothed his sleeve, and once, without hesitation, lifted a piece of duck from her own plate and placed it to his lips. The room froze again. Forks hovered mid-air. The act was small, but its meaning thundered. Feeding a slave at the mistress's table was a sin against every rule of Southern order. She smiled, aware of the shock, and said softly, "He eats only what I allow him. He belongs to my table as he does to me." Some laughed awkwardly. Others lowered their eyes. The air thickened with unease and fascination. The overseer, seated halfway down the table, shifted in his chair, his jaw tight. He could see the madness blooming behind her charm. Marco swallowed the food without expression. He tasted not duck but humiliation, not honey but fear. Around him, the laughter and whispers swirled, but none dared speak aloud the thought that hung like smoke in the room, that the mistress of Magnolia Vale had crossed from power into something darker. When the final toast was made, Constance raised her glass high. "To beauty," she said, her eyes fixed on Marco. "Even when the world cannot understand it." The guests echoed the toast with trembling smiles, but as they drank, every one of them knew they would leave that house with a story they could never tell without shuddering. The feast had ended, but its taste, sickly sweet and burning, would linger long after the candles died. The storm came without warning, rolling in from the river with a voice like anger. The sky split open, spilling white fire across the fields of Magnolia Vale. Rain beat against the shutters, wind howled down the chimneys, and the old house groaned as if it remembered every secret ever buried within its walls. Somewhere in the darkness, Constance Bellamy lay awake, her pulse rising with the storm. When the clock struck midnight, the bell in her hallway rang, once a sound meant for one person alone. Marco rose from his narrow bed, the thunder shaking the floor beneath him. He did not need to be told what the summons meant. The air was already thick with her perfume. He walked the long corridor toward her chambers, each flash of lightning painting his shadow against the walls. Constance was waiting by the window, her figure framed in pale light, her silk gown clinging to her like mist. The storm wind had blown her hair loose, strands of it catching the glow of the fire behind her. She turned as he entered, her eyes wide and wild, her face softened by something that looked almost like desperation. "You came," she said quietly. "I was not sure you would." He said nothing. He never did. Obedience had long ago replaced his voice. She studied him, her gaze moving from his face to the mark on his shoulder, the brand Horace Vane had left years before. She crossed the room and touched it with the back of her hand. The contact was soft but heavy with meaning. "Do you know why I keep you here?" she asked. Marco's eyes stayed on the floor. "To serve you," he said. A small, humorless laugh escaped her. "No. The world threw you away because you didn't fit inside its cruel little boxes. Too white to be a slave, too black to be free. But I see you, Marco. You are mine because the world would not have you." The wind screamed through the window, the candles flickering wildly. She stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under her weight. Her hands rose to his face, tracing the line of his jaw, his throat. He stood still, his body cold and rigid, his breath shallow. There was no malice in her touch, only a need that had nowhere to go, twisted by loneliness and power. When she kissed him, it was not a question. It was command wrapped in tenderness, the kind that makes cruelty look like love. He did not resist. He understood the truth that night beneath the roar of the thunder that in Magnolia Vale, resistance was meaningless. Outside, the rain fell harder, washing the dust from the earth. Inside, beneath the soft moan of the wind and the mistress's whispered prayers, a silence grew between them that would never be clean again. Winter crept softly over Magnolia Vale, dimming the light that once poured through its tall windows. The air grew heavy with the smell of damp wood and old perfume. Within its walls, Constance Bellamy's world began to contract. She stopped attending church, stopped receiving guests, and stopped writing to the other widows who once admired her feasts and envied her wealth. Her days now revolved around one figure, the pale servant who walked her halls like a spirit she could not exorcise. At first, it had been fascination, then pity. Now, it had become something darker, something that hollowed her from the inside. Constance began to believe Marco had been sent to her not by chance, but by Providence itself. He was, she told herself, the answer to years of whispered mockery, the proof that her suffering had purpose. When she looked at him, she saw not a man but a divine message carved in white flesh. Every evening she called for him, her voice trembling with hunger and devotion. He would stand quietly at the foot of her bed as she read aloud from her Bible, her tone rising and falling with feverish conviction. "The Lord delivers his angels to those who have sinned," she whispered one night, her eyes shining with tears. "And I have sinned, Marco. Oh, I have sinned." Her hands, jeweled and trembling, reached for his wrist. She traced the veins beneath his skin as if reading scripture. To the servants, the house had become haunted. They whispered that the mistress no longer slept, that the glow of candlelight from her room burned through the night like a vigil. Some swore they heard her praying in tongues, others claimed she spoke to the dead husband whose portrait hung above her bed. But it was Marco she prayed over most. She would make him kneel before her and press her palms to his shoulders, muttering that God had sent him to wash her soul clean. Marco endured it silently. He had learned that words meant danger in this place, yet each time her fingers brushed his skin, a sickness grew in his stomach, not from disgust but from the realization that her madness had no bottom. He could feel it spreading through the house, into the walls, into the air itself. One night, she covered him with a linen cloth as if he were an altar. "Do you see?" she said softly, tears streaking her powdered cheeks. "You were made pure so that I could be forgiven." Her voice broke into a whisper. "If I love you, God must love me still." The words fell like ashes between them. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and the once proud halls of Magnolia Vale groaned under the weight of her delusion. In that house of sugar and silence, Marco finally understood that what held him there was not chains, not law, but faith twisted into something far more dangerous. By spring, the air around Magnolia Vale had changed. What had once been the sweet perfume of magnolia and sugar now carried the sharper scent of suspicion. The servants no longer met each other's eyes when they crossed the halls, for they had learned that silence was the only shield left in that house. But silence, like rot, never stays buried for long. Reuben Cade, the overseer, was the first to break it. He was a broad man with a temper like fire and a mouth that never learned to close. For years he had ruled the fields with cruelty, his whip striking with more pleasure than purpose. Yet even he had begun to notice the strange rhythms of life inside the big house. He saw how the mistress called for the pale boy at all hours, how her candle burned through the night, and how Marco emerged pale and shaken when dawn broke. Reuben was not a man of conscience, but he was a man who recognized power when it could be turned into profit. One evening, after the day's work had ended and the cicadas had begun their steady song, he approached Constance on the veranda. She sat, fanning herself, her face glistening in the heat. He stood just beyond the reach of the lantern light, his voice low and slick. "Ma'am," he said, "you've got yourself a fine secret here. But secrets don't stay quiet without help." Constance's fan stilled. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Cade?" He smiled, showing teeth stained from tobacco. "I'm just saying, it'd be a shame if word reached Reverend Holt about the kind of company you keep at night. Folks already whisper, you know. I could keep them quiet, though if a man were properly compensated." For a moment, the only sound was the buzz of insects. Then Constance laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut glass. "You think you can shame me?" she said, her voice trembling between fury and fear. "You think I care what that preacher or anyone else says about me?" Reuben took a step closer. "You might not care about talk, ma'am, but the bank does. Land's worth less when the owner's reputation stinks." That struck her where he intended. By the next morning, a deed to 20 acres on the southern edge of Magnolia Vale lay on Reuben Cade's desk, along with a pouch of silver coins. He told himself it was justice for years of hard work, but deep down he knew he had bought a piece of her fear. Yet fear has a way of multiplying. Within weeks, whispers crept beyond the property line. The house servants told the field hands. The field hands told the traders. By summer, even the preacher's wife was repeating the story in hushed tones, that the widow Bellamy had taken a ghost for a lover, a pale demon she kept locked inside her home. Constance pretended not to hear. But each time she passed a servant who lowered their gaze, each time a letter from town went unanswered, she felt the weight of their judgment pressing against her throat. The plantation that once obeyed her now looked at her as though she were cursed, and somewhere in the shadows, Reuben Cade smiled, knowing the price of his silence had only begun to rise. The night it happened, the moon hung low and red over Magnolia Vale, the kind of moon that made men restless and cruel. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and sweat, and the distant croak of bullfrogs rolled from the swamp like the sound of an ancient drum. Marco had gone to the smokehouse alone, sent by Constance to fetch a cut of cured pork for her supper. It was a simple task, one he had done 100 times before. But that night, someone was waiting for him. Reuben Cade stepped out from the shadows, his face slick with whiskey and malice. The lantern in his hand cast his grin in uneven light. "Evenin', ghost boy," he drawled, his voice low and mean. "Didn't hear you come in. You move quiet, like a thief, or like something not quite human." Marco froze. His instincts screamed to walk away, but Cade took a step closer, blocking the only exit. "I've been thinkin'," Reuben said, circling him like a wolf. "Maybe you ain't a slave at all. Maybe you're some kind of witch she keeps for her pleasure. Folks in town already whisper about the widow and her pale boy. Fat woman's ghost lover, that's what they're callin' you now." Marco said nothing. His silence only seemed to feed the overseer's cruelty. Cade laughed, the sound echoing off the walls. "She feedin' you fine, ain't she? Silk on your back, sweet in your mouth. Bet she keeps you in her bed too." His voice grew uglier with each word. "Tell me, ghost, what's it like servin' a sow who thinks you're an angel?" Something broke inside Marco, then not anger, but something deeper, older, something made of years of being touched, mocked, owned. Cade reached out and shoved him, hard enough to make him stumble against the wall. The lantern swung wildly, light flashing across the iron tools and wooden beams. Marco's eyes fell on the shovel leaning by the door. His hands moved before his mind could stop them. The first blow landed with a dull, wet sound. Cade staggered, eyes wide with disbelief. The second came harder. The third silenced him completely. When the shovel slipped from Marco's grip, the overseer lay sprawled in the dirt, his head twisted unnaturally, his blood spreading dark and slow across the floor. The night grew still. The lantern flickered and went out, leaving only the smell of iron and smoke. Marco stood over the body, chest heaving, unable to tell if the pounding in his ears was thunder or his own heartbeat. The silence that followed felt alive, pressing in on him from every corner of the room. Outside, the wind stirred the magnolia trees, their white petals falling like snow. Somewhere in the house beyond the fields, Constance Bellamy was waiting for her supper, unaware that in the smokehouse, her ghost had finally learned how to bleed. The body was found before dawn. A stable boy saw the smear of blood trailing from the smokehouse door and ran screaming through the yard. By the time Constance arrived, her robe dragging through the mud, Reuben Cade's corpse lay half in shadow, half in moonlight, his eyes glassy, his mouth still twisted in surprise. The shovel leaned beside him like an accusation. Marco stood a few steps away, his clothes soaked red, his face pale and empty as porcelain. For a long moment Constance said nothing. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her eyes darting between the body and the boy. She knew at once what this meant. A slave killing a white man, no matter the cause, was death by rope, by bullet, by fire. Magnolia Vale would become a public spectacle, and she, already whispered about for her strange attachment to him, would be ruined. The law would not care about reason. It never did. "Go back to the house," she said finally, her voice trembling. Marco didn't move. He looked at her as if he were still trapped in the moment of the killing, as if his body hadn't caught up to what his hands had done. She crossed to him and gripped his face hard enough to leave marks. "Do as I say." He obeyed then, walking barefoot through the mud toward the mansion, the night air alive with the sound of his labored breathing. By sunrise, the yard had been scrubbed. Cade's body was dragged to the edge of the swamp and buried beneath a willow tree. Constance ordered her foreman to say nothing, and when the sheriff arrived later that afternoon, summoned by rumor, she was ready. She met him in the parlor, a decanter of brandy glinting between them, her smile steady but her eyes wild. "Reuben Cade ran off," she told him, pressing a folded envelope across the table. "He stole from me. You'll find his trail headed toward Vicksburg." The sheriff weighed the envelope, felt the soft rustle of banknotes inside, and nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can do, ma'am." The lie took root easily. Money grew faster than truth in Mississippi soil, but Constance's fear did not fade. That night, she went to Marco's quarters. He sat on the bed, still wearing the same blood-stained shirt, his eyes unfocused. "You've damned us both," she whispered. "Do you understand that?" He did not reply. Something in him had gone quiet, hollowed out by what he had done. "You killed a man," she said. "That cannot go unpunished. Your body may belong to me, but your soul belongs to God, and He will not forgive unless you suffer." She led him to the cellar, a narrow room beneath the kitchen, damp and airless. Without explanation, she shoved him inside and turned the key. 3 days, she said through the door, "for cleansing." The first day, he called out to her, his voice hoarse, begging for water. On the second, he began to pray, the words broken, slipping into fevered whispers. By the third, he had stopped speaking altogether. Hunger burned through him until the edges of the world began to blur. He dreamed of Cade's face, of blood seeping into the dirt, of Constance's hands trembling as she shut him away. When the door finally opened, light spilled into the darkness, and for a moment she saw what her punishment had made. His eyes, once gray and soft, now looked like pieces of broken glass. His lips were cracked, his skin pale to the point of translucence. He blinked at her slowly, unrecognizing. "Marco," she said, kneeling beside him. "It's over now. You're forgiven." But forgiveness was not what she saw in his face. He looked past her, through her, as if the person she had locked in that cellar had never returned. The boy she had once called her porcelain angel was gone. What emerged in his place was something colder, quieter, stripped of fear and mercy. As she helped him to his feet, Constance realized the truth too late. In trying to cleanse him, she had freed him from everything that once made him hers. Morning came gray and silent over Magnolia Vale, a kind of silence that felt unnatural, as though the air itself was holding its breath. The plantation no longer hummed with the rhythm of labor or the chatter of servants. Word of Reuben Cade's disappearance had already begun to twist into rumor, and rumor, as always, grew like weeds. Constance Bellamy sat alone in her study, the curtains drawn tight, her hands trembling over a blank sheet of paper. The ink well beside her reflected her face pale, swollen and unrecognizable. For days, sleep had refused her. Every sound in the house, the creak of the floors, the whisper of wind through the shutters, felt like Cade's voice calling her name from the grave. She had told herself the matter was buried, that the swamp would keep its secrets, yet her heart refused to quiet. In the sleepless hours of the night, she thought not of Cade, but of Marco. His silence haunted her more deeply than any ghost could. He moved through the house like a shadow now, his eyes dull, his presence unsettling. He obeyed her still, but the obedience had changed. There was no submission in it anymore, only distance, a stillness that frightened her. She dipped the pen into the ink and began to write. The words came haltingly at first, like confessions pulled from a wound. "To Reverend Holt," she wrote, "I seek your counsel, though I do not deserve it. I am a woman of great sin. I have offended both flesh and spirit. I have loved where I should have commanded, and in my hunger I have broken the boundary between mistress and slave, between salvation and damnation." Her handwriting shook as she continued. "The Lord sent me an angel, pale as bone, marked by suffering, a mirror for my shame. I told myself he was sent to save me, but I see now that he was sent to expose me. I touched what was holy and made it unclean. I have destroyed him with my love and myself with the lie that it was ever holy." Tears stained the page. Her chest rose and fell, as if each word she wrote stole the breath from her lungs. She paused, staring at the letter until the words blurred into a black smear of ink and grief. The clock in the hall struck noon, and still she sat there, the sound of the chimes echoing like judgment. When she finished, she folded the pages with care and sealed them in an envelope. The wax dripped like blood over her trembling hands. For a long moment, she stared at it. The edges still warm, the confession ready to be delivered. But then came the thought she could not silence if she sent it. Everything would unravel. The land, the money, the name Bellamy, all would burn under the weight of her truth. Constance pressed the letter to her lips, whispering a prayer that felt more like an apology than repentance. Then she opened the drawer of her writing desk and slid it inside, beneath old ledgers and deeds. "Forgive me, Lord," she said softly. But not yet. That night, as the rain began to fall, the sealed letter remained hidden in the dark, its confession trapped in wax and silence. Upstairs, Marco walked the hallway like a ghost that refused to rest, and in her dreams, Constance Bellamy saw her own reflection pale and watchful, whispering from the mirror the words she would never send. The bells of Sunday morning tolled across the river, slow and heavy, carried on a mist that clung to the earth like grief. Magnolia Vale should have been alive with preparation for church, but no carriage left the estate that day. The mistress had not attended a service in months, and the servants no longer asked why. Constance Bellamy's world had shrunk to the confines of her grand dining room, her prayers whispered not to God but to her own reflection in the mirrors that lined the walls. By evening, the storm clouds had gathered again, bruising the sky purple and gold. The smell of rain mixed with the sweetness of baked ham and brandied fruit that wafted from the kitchen. Constance had ordered a full supper, though no guests were expected. She insisted on ceremony even when no one remained to witness it. The table gleamed under candlelight, silver polished until it threw back her own weary face in fragments. When she entered, the servants stood aside like statues, their eyes low, their silence thick with unspoken things. Marco was not among them. He had vanished somewhere into the deeper halls of the house. His presence now felt more than seen. She pretended not to notice his absence. She had grown accustomed to speaking to emptiness. She began to eat, slowly at first, her fork trembling as she lifted each bite to her lips. The food was rich and perfumed, but it no longer brought her pleasure. It filled the hollow places inside her only for a moment before dissolving into the same familiar ache. Between bites, she reached for her wine glass and whispered to the room, "They think I am cursed." Her voice was calm, almost conversational. "But God curses only those he once loved." The servants lingered by the door, still as the portraits that watched from above. No one dared interrupt her monologue. She spoke of salvation and sin, of angels and ghosts, her words spilling like confessions to the empty chairs around her. The candles flickered as thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking the windows in their frames. Her hand reached for another piece of meat, glistening with glaze, but it froze halfway. For a moment, she seemed to listen for something, perhaps a voice, perhaps forgiveness, and then her eyes widened. The fork slipped from her fingers and struck the plate with a sharp metallic chime. Constance gasped, her chest tightening beneath the weight of years and guilt. Her face turned pale, her body trembling as she clutched at the edge of the table. The servants did not move. Some turned away. Others simply watched, their faces expressionless. No one dared to touch her, not even when her chair tipped forward and she collapsed across the table, her cheek pressing into the cooling food. Her heart gave one final shudder, then stopped. The candles hissed in their holders, one by one, until the room fell into half-darkness. Her jeweled bracelets clinked softly against the silverware as her body settled, the sound fading into silence. Outside, the rain began to fall in earnest, washing over the house that had witnessed too much sin and too little mercy. Inside, the mistress of Magnolia Vale lay among her feast, surrounded by the riches that had long since devoured her soul. No one wept. The servants slowly backed away, closing the great doors behind them. In the quiet that followed, the last candle guttered out, and for the first time in years, Magnolia Vale knew peace. But upstairs, in the dim corridor beyond the staircase, Marco stood at the landing, watching the flicker of her final light fade beneath the door. He did not smile. He simply turned and walked back into the darkness, the echo of her death following him like a prayer unanswered. The news of Constance Bellamy's death spread across the county before the soil of her grave had settled. By the next morning, Magnolia Vale was no longer a house of whispers but of vultures. The Bellamy relatives came in droves, dressed in mourning black that could not disguise the glint of greed in their eyes. They arrived not to pay respects, but to collect what they believed was rightfully theirs. The lawyer from Vicksburg, a thin man with spectacles too large for his face, stood in the parlor surrounded by the scent of mildew and the restless sound of silk skirts. He unfolded the sealed parchment slowly, his voice trembling not from grief but from the weight of what he was about to unleash. Marco stood in the corner, silent as ever, his presence drawing as many stares as the will itself. "This document," the lawyer began, "being the last will and testament of Mrs. Constance L. Bellamy, widow of Jonathan Bellamy, declares her wishes concerning the distribution of her estate." The room leaned forward like a single living thing. To her surviving relatives, she leaves the sum of $100 each. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Several women exchanged looks of disbelief, and a man in the back muttered a curse beneath his breath. The lawyer hesitated before continuing. The remainder of her property, including the house, the land, and all assets therein, are to be transferred to her servant, Marco, upon the condition that he remain within the state of Mississippi as a free man. The silence that followed was violent. Then came the outcry. "Lies!" someone shouted. "She was not in her right mind." Another voice rose, sharp with hatred. "That creature bewitched her." The lawyer tried to continue reading, but the noise drowned him out. Chairs scraped across the floor, and one of the Bellamy men lunged toward Marco, his face red with rage. "He's a devil," the man spat. "A white-skinned demon that turned her against her own blood." His wife clutched his arm, but her eyes were fixed on Marco, filled with the same mixture of fascination and disgust that had haunted him his entire life. Marco didn't move. He felt the tension in the air like static before a storm. The lawyer raised his voice, trying to restore order. "The will is signed and witnessed," he said. "It bears the seal of Reverend Holt and the signature of her housekeeper. It is legal and binding." But legality meant nothing to the Bellamys. One of the nephews snatched the document from the lawyer's hands, crumpling it in his fist. "We'll see it burned before we let a slave own Magnolia Vale." He strode toward the fireplace, but the lawyer grabbed his arm, shouting that tampering with a will was a crime. The scuffle drew the others in, voices overlapping, curses flying. Marco stood apart from it all, watching the chaos unfold. For the first time in his life, the walls of Magnolia Vale were not closing in on him. The house, once filled with her perfume and her voice, felt strange, now emptier, freer, but also dangerous. He could see it in their faces. They would not let him leave alive if the law favored him. The lawyer managed to rescue the will, tucking it back into his case as he shouted for calm. The document will be submitted to the court, he said breathlessly. Until then, the property remains as written. The Bellamys fell into bitter silence, but their eyes promised vengeance. As they stormed from the parlor, one of the women turned back toward Marco. "You'll never own this place," she hissed. "You can't own what was bought with sin." When the doors slammed shut behind them, the house exhaled, its echo deep and hollow. Marco remained where he stood, the firelight flickering across his pale face. He looked around the room, the chandeliers, the velvet drapes, the portraits that no longer frightened him, and understood what Constance had done. She had given him freedom, but not peace. Her final act of mercy was also a curse, binding his name to hers forever. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance once more, and the magnolia trees bent beneath the wind. Magnolia Vale still belonged to him, but the land already felt like it was waiting to reclaim its dead. The night Magnolia Vale burned began in stillness. The air was thick and heavy, as if the land itself was holding a secret it could no longer bear. The storm that had threatened all day never came, and the heat clung to everything: the magnolia trees, the columns, even the marble angels that guarded the Bellamy crypt. Marco sensed it before it happened. There was something unnatural in the quiet, a tension humming through the walls like a held breath waiting to break. The Bellamy heirs had left the house that afternoon, but their words lingered like poison. They had sworn to reclaim what was theirs, and though the law might have tied their hands, hatred needed no permission to act. As dusk fell, Marco moved through the dark halls, collecting what little of himself he owned. He found the letter Constance had written, the confession she had sealed, but never sent, hidden in the drawer of her writing desk. The wax had cracked, the edges singed from a candle that had long since gone out. He tucked it into his coat, along with the small silver cross that once hung from her neck. He did not know why he took them, only that they felt like the last proof that either of them had ever existed. The first torch landed near the stables. He saw it from the window, a flicker of orange that bloomed into a roar. Then came the second, striking the dry grass by the smokehouse. Within minutes, the night exploded into chaos. Flames crawled up the side of the mansion like living things, devouring paint and wood and memory. Shouts echoed from beyond the gate, the voices of men drunk on vengeance and righteousness. They shouted that no devil would inherit Magnolia Vale, that the house must die with the woman who had disgraced it. Marco ran through the corridors as the heat rose around him, the floorboards beginning to smoke beneath his bare feet. The portraits of the Bellamy ancestors watched in silence as the fire reached them, their painted eyes melting into dark streaks. Curtains ignited like paper, chandeliers crashed to the ground, and the scent of burning magnolia filled the air, sweet and suffocating. He tried to reach the front door, but it was already engulfed. The only way out was through the back, toward the swamp. He tore through the kitchen, coughing, his lungs filled with ash. The walls moaned as beams cracked and fell. Behind him, the great staircase collapsed in a burst of sparks. Every room he passed seemed to scream, the sound of wood splitting mixing with the memory of Constance's laughter. For a moment, he thought he saw her standing at the end of the hall, her red silk gown flickering in the firelight. But it was only smoke and shadow. When he burst through the rear door, the night air hit him like cold water. He ran toward the swamp, his vision blurring with smoke and tears. Behind him, the mansion burned like a pyre against the sky. The fire's reflection danced across the surface of the water, turning the black swamp gold. He stumbled through the mud, clutching the letter and the silver cross to his chest as if they were relics of a life already gone. By the time he reached the far side of the marsh, Magnolia Vale had begun to collapse. The great roof caved inward with a sound like thunder, sending a cloud of embers into the night. The columns fell one by one, white turning to black, until the house was nothing but flame and ruin. Marco turned once, watching the last of it burn. In the glow, he felt no triumph, only a hollow ache that the fire could not touch. Everything that had bound him to that place, its cruelty, its beauty, its mistress, was being erased. Yet, as the flames devoured the house, he realized the fire had not destroyed his chains. It had simply changed their shape. He walked deeper into the swamp, the water rising around his ankles, the stars hidden behind a curtain of smoke. In his hand, the silver cross gleamed faintly in the dark, and beneath it, the letter pressed against his heart like a wound that would never heal. Behind him, Magnolia Vale died screaming, and with it, the last of who Marco had been. The years softened the memory of Magnolia Vale, but they never erased it. The land along the Yazoo River swallowed what remained of the Bellamy estate, and wild vines crept over the foundation where marble columns once gleamed. Locals said nothing grew there quite right anymore. The soil stayed too dark, too wet, as if it still remembered the blood and ash it had absorbed. Yet on certain nights, when the mist rolled thick off the river, travelers swore they saw someone moving along the old road. A figure pale as moonlight, barefoot and silent, walking with something clutched tightly in his hand. They called him the White Ghost of the River Bend. The story changed with every retelling. Some said he was the restless spirit of a slave who'd gone mad after killing his master. Others swore he was the devil himself, cursed to wander the earth for loving a woman who belonged to another. But those who had seen him closely spoke in quieter tones. They said his eyes were human, tired, sad. They said he looked like a man still searching for a place he once called home. No one knew his name, but the old folk who had lived long enough to remember the fire whispered it under their breath. Marco, the boy with white skin who came from Cedar Hill, the one who survived the mistress and the flames, the one who had walked into the swamp and never come out. It was said he lived near the river now, deep among the cypress trees, where the fog never lifted. A fisherman once claimed he saw him kneeling by the water's edge at dawn, holding a piece of paper burned around the edges, its ink blurred by time and rain. Another told of a silver cross glinting around his neck, catching the morning light before disappearing again into the mist. Those who tried to follow him never could. He vanished between the trees, moving with a stillness that defied the living. Children were warned not to wander near the river at night, lest the ghost mistake them for the soul he was waiting for. Some said he waited for the woman who had owned him. Others said he waited for God. Decades passed, and the world changed around the river. The war came and went, freedom was written into law, and the land where Magnolia Vale once stood became overgrown and forgotten. But still, the stories remained. Travelers continued to speak of the pale man with hollow eyes, the one who carried a letter that could never be read and a sorrow that could never die. One summer evening, a preacher passing through the county stopped by an old inn along the Yazoo. As he sat by the hearth, the locals told him the tale. The preacher, curious, asked what the letter said. The innkeeper, an old woman with a voice soft as gravel, smiled sadly. "It's a confession," she said. "A woman's plea for forgiveness she never sent, and he's still waiting for the Lord to open it." Outside, the river whispered against its banks, dark and endless. Somewhere beyond the bend, a pale figure moved through the reeds, his footsteps soundless, his gaze fixed on something only he could see. The moon caught the silver of the cross at his throat before he vanished once more into the fog. And in that silence, as the water rippled and the trees shivered under the night wind, the legend lived on. Some said he was a ghost. Others believed he was simply a man who had lost too much to ever return to the world. But those who truly listened to the river swore that every now and then, if the night was still enough, they could hear a voice low, fragile, and full of longing whisper her name into the dark.